I want to show you the use of layers to control the image that you're going to produce in Photoshop. Layers is like looking at a sandwich with bread and mayonnaise and meat and tomato and lettuce and onions and other sauce and whatever. You're looking down on the sandwich, and that's what you're seeing in layers. You see over here in my layers tab here, the wreath is this top thing I'm seeing here. Then I'm looking at the S, and then down underneath that's this and this and this, and this, all the way to the bottom where you get this background, which is the color that we're looking at. Now, let me get showing you how this is put together. I've cut these things, these images out before. I've trimmed them all away, so all I have is the images, no background, but then I can lay them on top of each other in this square pattern. Now when I turn these layers off by hitting the little eyeballs here, they go away, and you have then just the base or the background object here. And it's a light orange to dark orange gradient in a radial form so that it starts in the center and grows outwardly. Now, in Illustrator, I produced these one square, and then I made more squares, as we did back on that quilt project. And I've got then these squares. I'm going to use them as a cut pattern, as if they were a cookie cutter. Now, with my magic wand tool, I can select, whoops, I've got the wrong layer here. Command D, so let's go back to my black square. See, I have to have the blue background that makes it active in this black square. So I select one square and the marching ants around it. Now under select, I can come down to not similar layers, but just similar objects selected. And when I select that, notice it selects all of the black. It's picking on the black because that's the most similar thing. If these were black and red, it would pick only the red ones if I selected the red one to start with. Okay, so you see those going. Now if I turn off the eyeball, the black goes away, but the little marching ants are still there. And if I go down to the original background, and let's take this one out. Well, I already made that. Let's make it now. Okay, so I'm going to go down to the original background, and I'm going to cut what's inside of all these little marching ants. Command C. Now to show you, I'm going to make a new layer here and put these layers here and call it orange squares. O-R-A-N-G-S-Q-U-A-R-E-S. And then I'm going to, on that layer, I'm going to hit Command V and paste on that layer those squares. Well, you say, where are they? Look what happens when I turn off the background. There they are. I cut exactly the same color in gradients in the light to medium orange, and I put them on. So with the background showing along with the foreground, you can't see them. But now I can do a little bit of a trick to these orange squares in that I can select that layer and go down here, and under the FX or the filters, I can select drop shadow, the first effect. And my drop shadows is giving me a preview, and you can see what's going on here. You can move the shadow from light coming from the upper left to the upper right or the lower right. And you see how the shadows things, depending on where you want to go with this. I'm going to make it come from the upper left to the lower right. I can also make the distance of the shadow greater, and they can, be a lot more space between the first layer and the second. I can make the spread a little wider, so it's like the distance, only it sort of muffles the edge a little bit, or the size really muffles the edge and gives it a blur if you want that. So I want to see some difference, so I'll go with that. And you see now I have a shadow that's actually a part of this layer. When I said OK here, now the effects is actually put here, so I can take the effects on and off if I wanted to. Let's take this one down, and now you see the effects without the shadow, with the shadow, that effect that I created. Now with the background in place and this layer orange squares with the shadow, you can see I've made a very subtle looking tile, if you want to call it that, that's backed up against this brown. Now with that black square that I had before, I also took that and made this squares. You can see I've added texture inside these squares and made a little bevel out of here, so it almost looks like bathroom tile. So there's, without the top texture, which is itself its own layer, made by the copy of these black squares and then turning the black into these random color pieces. And so that's getting to be more useful. Now I've added the wreath, which is, I cut this wreath out and very carefully made all the little fuzzles and buzzles here and put a shadow. I'll take the shadow off so you can see the edges very carefully cut out inside and out, so I have that wreath. And then I've added the drop shower layer to that, filter to that, to give it a little more depth, pushing away from that tile. I've made this S out of a, well, it's a music symbol for the upper clef, and I gave it some beveling using in the filters. There's a bevel and emboss thing there that you can experiment with. But I've given it a little bit of bevel, so it's got a light edge and a neutral face and a dark, shadowy inside edge here to make it look almost like metal. Now, the last thing I put here is this wreath. Now, the wreath was the original wreath with all of the bells and whistles, but I have, let me cut away the S here. You see, I've actually taken the S and traced around it and cut away that. So the S here is like on top of all of this, and it goes underneath here. So I'm going to put it back. I'm seeing the S because I've cut away the wreath. But here I didn't, and so the wreath looks like it's going over the S, so it's intertwined. Now that I have all this done, oh, the wreath, by the way, was in a color image, and I have used filters on that wreath base. I went up to filter artistic and made it a dry brush, one of my favorites, or paint dabs. And you can experiment with all of these yourself. Take an object and select it on its layer and go make something happen in there, and it almost looks like now you've illustrated it. Now you can see that I've got my sandwich here, all these layers. That's fine. I save that so that it's in my files. All the layers are there in case I have to go back and check or change or borrow or modify for next year. So I save it as what I've called it, this layer here, layers wreath. Now, to go to the printer though, to be printed or go in some use, I have to go up here to this little button and say, I'm going to move this over so you'll see the whole thing. And I have to go to my options and come down to flatten image. And when I flatten the image, you see what happens is it will throw away all these layers I don't need, and I'm not going to do that just yet, but it throws them away and flattens it so that it's just one layer. Otherwise, when you print this, all you'd see would be the top wreath, because the printer only sees the top layer. So you make them all one layer, and it's the top layer and all layers together, and all these things go away, and there's only one layer here. And you save that again as layers, wreath, and put an F on it for flat. So now you have two versions, your layered version that you can still deal with, and your flattened version that's the final product that you're going to use in this print job. Now this could be used for any number of holiday graphics about Christmas music or whatever you're going to use it for, a big illustration, a small one, but it gives it much more dramatics. Another image that has a lot of dramatics, this picture I've got of the Red Baron as a newspaper, no, I'm sorry, as a magazine picture that would be on top of columns on a page in a magazine. Now, what I've done here, let me back off these layers and we'll talk of them one at a time. I started with a gray background because this hasn't got a lot of important stuff going on as far as big time color. And on that gray background, I put this picture of a German castle. Now, the castle is a straight photograph, but notice what I've done with it. I'll go here to make it active. It's 45% opacity. If I click here and I get the slide bar, there it is at 100%. And that's not bad, except it's too dominant. It's too strong. And I want that picture to stand in there. So I'm going to take this back down to the 45%. You can slide it or type it. And then now it's much more subtle. It's seeable, but it's behind. This picture I have of the Red Baron came from a photograph, well, a newspaper photograph. And it wasn't very good, and it was little dots and just sort of patterned. And I did the same thing with that as I did with the wreath thing before. I went to filter, to artistic, and went to dry brush. And that gave me more of an illustration than it was a photograph. I did come back with paint and coloration of his eyes and made his eyes all the same whites and grays and put little white dots there to make his eyes more dramatic. Now, he's wearing what's called the Blue Max. It's a military medal, and he was known for his military aviation feats of the German Air Force. And so I found a copy of the Blue Max in color, and I made that a layer, cut it out and put it there. Now that adds a touch of color, and the metal's a little more realistic. I also found a picture of his airplane in color and cut it out and sized it and put it over here just to add a touch of color in a lot of gray. And it's a dramatic. The airplane is actually hanging in a museum, and I took that picture and cut away all the stuff that wasn't the newspaper, wasn't the airplane. I did add a little red spherical helmet here, although they didn't wear helmets in those days. They wore leather coverings, but that looks better, I guess. At least it works. Now, the lettering, I used a letter, a dramatic looking letter, and I put a bevel on it and a drop shadow, and it said the Red Baron. And I also put lettering on another layer in that same dramatic layering and said the Blue Max. And then to tie all this together as part of the headline or the title of the story, I put a white ampersand to help tie it together. So now with these layers, I've got a magazine graphic that is a lot more dramatic and better than just the picture itself. And you get an idea of Germany, of the man himself, the plane he flew, and then the lettering showing the Red Baron and the Blue Max. So that again, I would save as the Red Baron and all the layers intact. Then I would go back and say flatten the image and save it again, but this time save it with an F in the title so you know of the two, one of them is flat and ready to be used for printing. The last one is this slide that is used for PowerPoint in a humanities class. We're going to talk about studying the humanities. And so there's a lot of information that is part of a humanities study, and I'm starting with a light brown background. I'm going to add my first layer is the CBS logo, that all-seeing eye, to represent electronic communications. And it has a bit of a bevel. You see the light side and the dark side, and it gives it a little more three-dimension. Then I'm going to add an illustration by N.C. Wyeth of a pirate out of Treasure Island. And he's mysterious looking, and he's got that chrome thing or brass thing, I don't know what that is, telescope probably, in his hand, and he gives some era of mystery. Then for humor and part of another cultural thing, Popeye the Sailor Man with a bit of a shadow to him to add that big color emphasis going on there. Then I got a picture of Mozart. Now it's just a square picture as if it were on a canvas or a frame. And it overlaps Popeye because he's on top. That layer is on top of Popeye, but that's part of the layout now that I'm using. I took a picture of a opera singer. She's sitting in a chair, which they don't usually do, and she has a mirror in her hand, but she looks very dramatic. And she's making the span between Mozart and the pirate, and is a dramatic front piece for what we're talking about, the study of humanities. I took the character, a very contemporary character out of our movies, Yoda, and he's gripping his lightsaber and looking like he's full of action. And to enhance that, I added more glow around the saber. Here's the lightsaber with glow. There's without, and there's with. So it's a little more glowy. And then the last thing I'm going to add is the lettering. You can do lettering in Photoshop, and I've laid it out. You can also do it in Illustrator and bring it across and put it as long as you're following your layout. And here's that lettering in all caps with a drop shadow on it to make it stand out away from the background. And then the headline is the same lettering, same size, a little bigger so it looks like a headline, a little stronger shadow, drop shadow. So now here again is layers. I save it as layers, and then I save it again as a flat object, and the flat object is what I would put into my PowerPoint presentation for a classroom lecture. So with all of these things, it shows the use of those layers for a design, for an effect, for a layout that all fits together and makes for one picture out of a series of pictures, like a montage or a self-contained layout thing that's working for us. And that's what's useful in seeing how you can use layers and control those layers so that your final result works to be very obvious impact on your audience.